Kethavar sat in the dim light of the veterans' hall, his forearms wrapped around a cup of fermented grain alcohol that had long since grown cold. The purple-scaled Zephyrian warrior's eyes, all 6 of them, stared into the amber liquid, as if searching for answers that would never come. Around him, other battle-scarred soldiers from a dozen different species shared their own quiet moments, but none dared approach the legendary fighter who had once commanded fleets across 3 star systems. The younger soldiers whispered about him in hushed tones. They spoke of his victories against the crystalline horde, his tactical genius during the siege of Corvath Prime, and his unbreakable will that had earned him the highest military honors their civilization could bestow. But what they didn't know, what Kethavar had never spoken of in all his years since retirement, were the stories that truly haunted him. Stories of a species so terrifying in battle that even mentioning their name could cause veteran warriors to fall silent. Humans. Tonight felt different, though. Perhaps it was the anniversary of that cursed battle, or maybe it was the way the young Zephyrian cadet had looked at him earlier with such admiration and hunger for glory. The same look Kethavar himself had worn centuries ago, before he learned that some victories came with prices too terrible to bear. "Commander Kethavar?" The voice belonged to Sergeant Yixtal, a relatively young soldier with bright green scales that marked him as barely past his first molting. "The recruits, they're asking about your campaigns again. About what made you so successful?" Kethavar's mandibles clicked together in what might have been mistaken for amusement, but those who knew him recognized it as a sound of deep sorrow. He set down his cup and gestured to the empty chairs around his table. "Sit, Sergeant, and call the others who wish to hear. But understand this, what I'm about to tell you isn't a tale of glory or triumph. It's a warning." Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, veterans and recruits alike, drawn by the rare opportunity to hear the legendary commander speak of his past. Kethavar looked around the circle of eager faces and felt his heart sink. They all looked so young, so ready to charge into battle without understanding what true warfare meant. "You want to know what made me successful?" Kethavar began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "I was successful because I learned to fear the right enemies. Most commanders fear superior numbers, better weapons, or strategic disadvantage. I learned to fear something else entirely. I learned to fear humans." A ripple of confused murmurs passed through the group. Most of them had never encountered humans directly. The species was known to exist, certainly, but they were considered a minor power at best. Young, technologically inferior, confined to a small section of the Outer Rim territories. What could possibly be frightening about them? "I see your confusion," Kethavar continued. "I once shared it. My first encounter with humans came during what we called the Meridian Conflict. It should have been a simple operation, a show of force to discourage their expansion into Zephyrian space. We had everything: superior numbers, better weapons, faster ships. Our intelligence indicated they had barely developed faster-than-light travel. They should have surrendered at the first sign of our fleet." Kethavar paused to take a long drink, gathering his thoughts and his courage. The memories were always difficult to face. "The battle began as we expected. We dropped out of hyperspace in their system, a magnificent display of 47 ships arranged in perfect formation. Our communication officers sent the standard surrender demand, fully expecting compliance within hours. Instead, we received a single message back." The old commander's voice grew quiet, forcing his audience to lean forward to hear. The message was brief, just 4 words: "Come and take it." Our translators verified it multiple times, certain there had been some error. "How could a species with barely 12 ships dare to challenge a fleet like ours?" Our admiral, may his spirit find peace, laughed. He ordered the attack immediately, convinced we would be home within the cycle. Kethvar stood and walked to the great window that looked out over the military district. The lights of the city twinkled below like stars, peaceful and orderly. Nothing like the chaos he was about to describe. The first sign that something was wrong came when we approached their outermost planet. Our sensors detected massive energy signatures from what appeared to be empty space. Before we could investigate, our lead destroyer simply vanished. Not destroyed, vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, taking 300 crew members with it. "Cloaked mines?" suggested one of the recruits. "We thought so too," Kethvar replied. "But mines leave debris, energy signatures, something. This was different. We later learned that humans had discovered how to weaponize their primitive nuclear technology in ways we had never considered. They had created what they called antimatter mines, devices that could completely annihilate both matter and antimatter on contact. The explosion was contained in a fold of space-time, making it appear as if the ship had simply ceased to exist." The room fell silent. Antimatter weapons were theoretical at best for most species. The energy requirements alone should have made them impossible for a species as young as humanity. "But that was only the beginning," Kethvar continued. "As we advanced more carefully, we began to encounter their defensive fleet. 12 ships. As intelligence had indicated, 12 ships against 46 of ours after losing the destroyer. It should have been a massacre." "Was it?" asked Sergeant Yixtal. Kethvar's laugh was bitter. "Oh, it was. Just not in the way we expected. The humans didn't engage us in traditional combat. They didn't form battle lines or attempt to protect their heavy ships with lighter escorts. Instead, they scattered like prey animals, running in all directions. Our admiral was pleased. He ordered our ships to pursue and destroy them individually." "Standard hunter tactics," nodded one of the veterans. "Divide the enemy force and eliminate each component." "Standard tactics against a conventional enemy," Kethvar agreed. "But humans are not conventional. As our ships broke formation to pursue, we discovered that the humans hadn't fled in panic. They had deliberately separated us, drawing our forces away from mutual support. Each human ship had led our pursuers into carefully prepared kill zones." The old commander returned to his seat, his movements showing the weariness that came not from age, but from bearing the weight of terrible memories. "I was commanding the heavy cruiser Sharmoth at the time, pursuing what appeared to be a damaged human frigate. The enemy ship was leaking atmosphere and moving slowly, clearly trying to reach some kind of shelter behind a large asteroid. My gunnery officer requested permission to finish it quickly, but I wanted to capture it intact. Human technology was still largely unknown to us, and intelligence value was paramount." Kethvar paused, remembering the pride he had felt at that moment. He had been so certain of his superiority, so confident in his tactical acumen. As we closed to boarding range, the human ship suddenly accelerated at a rate that should have killed any organic crew. Our sensors detected massive G-force readings, levels that would turn most species into paste. Yet the ship moved with precision and purpose. Before we could react, it had somehow positioned itself directly beneath our hull, where our main weapons couldn't track. "A ramming attack?" asked one of the listeners. "I thought so too," Kethvar said. "But humans rarely do what you expect. Instead of ramming us, they latched onto our hull with some kind of magnetic anchor system. Then they began cutting through our armor with tools we had never seen before. Focused plasma cutters that could slice through military-grade plating like it was thin fabric." The audience exchanged worried glances. Hull-cutting tools were typically used for salvage operations, not combat. The idea of using them as weapons was both innovative and terrifying. Within minutes, they had breached our hull in 17 different locations, but rather than sending boarding parties through these breaches, they did something that still gives me nightmares. They flooded our ship with a substance our computers couldn't identify. It wasn't a gas or a liquid, but something in between, a kind of smart foam that expanded to fill every available space. "Chemical weapon?" suggested Sergeant Yixtal. No, Kethvar said quietly. It was far worse than that. The foam wasn't designed to kill us. It was designed to immobilize us completely. As it hardened, it formed a perfect mold around every crew member, holding us in place while still allowing us to breathe. We were trapped, conscious and aware, but utterly helpless. The room had grown cold, despite the heating units. Several of the younger soldiers were fidgeting nervously, beginning to understand why their commander seemed so haunted. Then the humans boarded our ship, but they didn't come as conquerors or warriors. They came as students. They moved through our vessel with scientific precision, cataloging our technology, studying our weapon systems, even taking biological samples from crew members who couldn't resist. They weren't trying to defeat us, they were trying to understand us. That's when I realized the true horror of what we were facing. This wasn't a battle to humans, it was an experiment. They had drawn us into their system not to defend their territory, but to study how we fought, how our ships operated, how our tactics functioned. Every move we made gave them more data, more information to use against us. Kethvar stood again and walked to a wall display that showed star charts of the local sector. His finger traced the boundaries of human space, boundaries that had expanded significantly since the Meridian conflict. The humans released us eventually after they had learned everything they could. They even repaired the damage to our ships and provided medical treatment for our injured. But they made sure we understood the lesson. We hadn't been defeated in battle. We had been captured, studied, and released like laboratory specimens. "What happened to the rest of the fleet?" asked a young recruit whose voice shook slightly. The other ships suffered similar fates. Each pursuit had led to a different type of trap, a different experimental scenario. The humans tested kinetic weapons against our shields, energy weapons against our armor, even psychological warfare techniques against our command structure. By the time Admiral Kavrin realized what was happening, they had detailed intelligence on every aspect of our military capabilities. Kethvar returned to his seat, suddenly looking far older than his centuries of life would suggest. But the worst part wasn't the capture or the experimentation. The worst part was what came next. As we limped back to Zephyrian space, our communications arrays detected transmissions from the human homeworld. They weren't military communications or emergency broadcasts. They were entertainment transmissions, what humans called movies or television shows. Entertainment? The confusion in the room was palpable. Our linguists translated them out of curiosity. What we discovered was that humans routinely created fictional scenarios more violent and destructive than any real warfare we had ever encountered. They imagined weapons that could destroy entire planets, strategies that involved the complete annihilation of enemy species, tactics that made our most brutal conflicts look like children's games. Kethvar picked up his cup again, draining the last of the cold alcohol. We had just experienced the most sophisticated military operation in our history, and to humans, it was apparently a minor tactical exercise. Their entertainment media suggested they could conceive of, and perhaps implement, forms of warfare that would leave nothing behind but empty space. The old commander looked around the circle of faces, seeing his own ancient fears reflected in their eyes. That's when I began to understand what we were truly facing. Not just another aggressive species expanding its territory, but a form of intelligence that approached conflict in ways we couldn't predict or counter. They didn't fight to win battles. They fought to learn how to win wars. And once they learned, they shared that knowledge through their entire species via their entertainment networks. A long silence settled over the group. Outside, the city continued its peaceful existence, unaware of the fears being shared in the Veterans Hall. "Did you ever encounter them again?" asked Sergeant Yixtal finally. Kethvar's mandibles clicked once more, that same sound of deep sorrow. "Oh yes, Sergeant. That was just the first tale. The humans and I crossed paths 2 more times after Meridian. Each encounter taught me more about what they were capable of, and each time I understood more clearly why the galaxy should fear them. He stood slowly, gathering his courage for what was to come. But those are stories for another night. Tonight, you've heard enough to understand why I never speak of glory anymore. Glory is for species that fight battles they can understand. The humans taught me that some battles aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be survived. As the group began to disperse, talking in hushed whispers about what they had heard, Kethvar remained at his table, staring into his empty cup. Tomorrow, he would tell them about the second encounter. Tomorrow, they would learn about the human concept of psychological warfare. Tonight, he would try to forget the sound of human laughter echoing through the corridors of his captured ship, the sound of a species that found joy in the act of learning how to destroy its enemies. In the distance, a transport ship lifted off from the spaceport, carrying trade goods to the Outer Rim territories. Kethvar watched it disappear into the stars and wondered if any of those goods were bound for human space. The thought made him shiver despite the warmth of the hall. The humans were still out there, still learning, still growing stronger. And somewhere in their vast information networks, the details of every military encounter they had ever participated in were being analyzed, categorized, and prepared for future use. Kethvar finished the last drops from his cup and walked slowly toward the exit. Behind him, the veterans' hall fell quiet, but the whispers and worried conversations would continue long into the night. Word would spread, as it always did among soldiers who had seen too much. The humans were coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually they would expand beyond their current borders. And when they did, they would bring with them everything they had learned from species like the Zephyrians. The old commander pulled his cloak tighter against the night air and walked home through empty streets, trying not to think about the second tale he would have to tell. The tale of what happened when humans decided to teach rather than learn. But that was a horror for another day. 3 nights had passed since Kethvar first spoke of the humans, and the Veterans' Hall had not been the same since. Word had spread through the military district like wildfire. Officers who had served under the legendary commander found excuses to visit, while younger soldiers gathered in small groups to whisper about the implications of what they had heard. The official military reports from the Meridian conflict had been classified for decades, but now fragments of truth were finally emerging. Kethvar had not returned to the hall during those 3 days. Some said he was ill, others that he was preparing his thoughts for the continuation of his tale. But Sergeant Yixtal, who had taken it upon himself to check on the old commander, knew the truth. Kethvar was afraid of the memories he would have to relive, afraid of the reactions his words would provoke, and most of all, afraid that speaking these truths aloud might somehow alert the humans to his location. On the 4th night, Kethvar appeared at his usual table as if nothing had changed. His cup of fermented grain alcohol sat before him, untouched, while his 6 eyes stared at some distant point beyond the walls of the hall. The crowd that gathered around him was larger this time, including several high-ranking officers who normally would not associate with retired personnel. Word had reached the upper echelons of command, and they wanted to hear for themselves what their former leader had to say about humanity. "Commander," Sergeant Yixtal began carefully, "are you prepared to continue your account?" Kethvar's mandibles clicked softly, a sound that had become familiar to his audience over the past few days. "Prepared? No, Sergeant. One is never prepared to revisit the moments when everything you believed about warfare, about honor, about the nature of conflict itself, crumbles before your eyes. But necessary things are rarely pleasant." He lifted his cup and took a small sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. The second encounter came 18 standard cycles after Meridian. I had been promoted to fleet commander by then, despite my reports about human capabilities being largely dismissed by high command. They preferred to believe that Meridian had been an anomaly, a lucky victory for an inferior species that would not be repeated. The crowd leaned forward, hanging on every word. Even the highest-ranking officers present seemed genuinely concerned about what they were about to hear. The conflict began over a disputed mining system called Xerion, 3 rocky planets rich in rare minerals, technically in unclaimed space, but close enough to our borders that we considered it within our sphere of influence. Human mining operations had established themselves there without permission, and the Zephyrian Mining Consortium demanded military intervention to remove them. Kethvar paused to study the faces around him. Several showed the kind of confidence that came from never having faced a truly dangerous enemy. I argued against military action. My reports from Meridian had described human tactical capabilities in detail, and I recommended diplomatic negotiations instead. But the mining consortium had significant political influence, and they pushed for immediate action. High Command assigned me to lead a task force of 15 ships, smaller than the Meridian fleet but still vastly superior to anything humans should have been able to field. "What was different about this engagement?" asked Colonel Vexithari, one of the senior officers present. "Everything," Kethavar replied simply. "At Meridian, the humans had been reactive. They responded to our actions with counter-tactics designed to neutralize our advantages. But at Xerion, they were proactive. They had spent 18 cycles analyzing our response patterns, and they were ready for us." The old commander stood and walked to the window, as had become his habit during these sessions. Outside, the peaceful city continued its nightly routine, unaware of the darkness being discussed within the hall. We arrived at Xerion expecting to find the same small fleet as before. Perhaps a dozen ships at most. Instead, our sensors detected no human vessels at all. The mining stations appeared to be completely abandoned with no signs of life or activity. It should have been a relief. We could simply occupy the system and claim it for Zephyrian interests. "But you suspected a trap," suggested Sergeant Yixtal. "I knew it was a trap," Kethvar corrected. "The question was what kind of trap, and how to avoid triggering it. I ordered the fleet to maintain maximum distance while we conducted detailed sensor sweeps of the entire system. What we found defied everything we thought we knew about human technology." He returned to his seat, his movements slower and more deliberate than usual. The mining stations weren't abandoned. They had been converted into something our computers couldn't classify. The energy readings were unlike anything in our databases. Not fusion, not antimatter, not even the exotic matter manipulation we had encountered at Meridian. Something entirely new. "What kind of energy?" asked one of the technical specialists present. "We never found out," Kethvar admitted. "But we learned what it could do. As we watched, the mining stations began to move. Not like ships with engines and propulsion systems, but like living things. They flowed through space, changing shape and configuration as they moved, maintaining structural integrity through methods that violated half a dozen laws of physics. The room had grown very quiet. Several of the younger soldiers looked pale, while the senior officers wore expressions of professional concern mixed with growing alarm. I ordered immediate withdrawal to a safe distance while we analyzed what we had seen. But as our ships began to turn away, we discovered that the humans had anticipated this reaction as well. The space around our fleet was no longer empty. Kethvar took another sip of his drink, this time draining nearly half the cup in a single gulp. They had surrounded us with something our sensors couldn't detect. Not ships, not mines, not any kind of technology we recognized. Our first indication of their presence came when Frigate Commander Kalthek attempted to jump to hyperspace. His ship simply stopped. One moment it was accelerating toward the jump point. The next, it was motionless in space, engines still running but producing no thrust. "Tractor beam?" suggested someone. "No. Tractor beams leave energy signatures and can be countered with sufficient power," This was different. It was as if space itself had become solid around his ship, trapping it in place without any visible means of confinement. The old commander's voice grew quieter, forcing his audience to strain to hear him. Then the humans began to communicate with us, but not through standard radio channels or subspace frequencies. They somehow transmitted directly into our ship's computers, bypassing all security protocols and encryption systems. The message appeared on every screen throughout the fleet, simultaneously. He paused, remembering the exact words that had appeared on his command display all those years ago. The message was an invitation. They wanted to discuss terms for sharing the Xerion system. Not surrender demands, not threats, not ultimatums. An invitation to negotiate, delivered through technology that made our most advanced computer systems look like primitive calculating devices. "That doesn't sound terrifying," observed one of the junior officers. "It sounds almost civilized." Kethvar's laugh was harsh and bitter. "That's what made it so frightening, Lieutenant. They had demonstrated the ability to disable our ships without firing a shot, to penetrate our computer systems at will, and to manipulate space itself in ways we couldn't understand. And they wanted to talk." "Did you accept the invitation?" asked Colonel Vexathari. "What choice did we have? Our ships were immobilized, our computer systems compromised, and our weapons apparently useless against technology we couldn't even detect. I agreed to meet with their representative." Kethvar stood again and walked to a different wall, this one decorated with portraits of famous Zephyrian military leaders, heroes who had won great victories against conventional enemies using conventional tactics. "The meeting took place aboard my flagship, the Kethvarthul. The humans transported their representative directly through our shields and hull armor, materializing him in my ready room without triggering any alarms or defensive systems. One moment I was alone. The next, a human male was sitting across from my desk as if he had always been there." "What did he look like?" asked someone. "Unremarkable," Kethavar replied. "Average height for his species, wearing simple civilian clothing that might have been found in any human colony. No weapons, no protective gear, no obvious technological enhancements. He could have been a merchant or a farmer for all his appearance suggested. But his presence was unsettling. Not because of anything he said or did, but because of what he represented. Here was a member of a species we had vastly underestimated, sitting calmly in the heart of our most powerful warship after demonstrating technologies that surpassed our understanding." Kethvar returned to his seat, lost in the memory of that long-ago encounter. He introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Chen, a xenopsychologist specializing in interspecies conflict resolution. Not a military officer, not a diplomat, but a researcher studying the psychological aspects of warfare between different species. He had come to Xerion not to fight us, but to learn how we thought. "Learn how you thought?" Sergeant Yixtal repeated. "Yes." He explained that humans had been analyzing our culture, our military doctrine, our historical conflicts, everything they could discover about how Zephyrians approached warfare. They had concluded that traditional military confrontation would be wasteful and unnecessary. Instead, they wanted to understand what motivated our aggression so they could address the root causes. The room had grown uncomfortably warm despite the cooling systems. Several soldiers were fidgeting nervously, beginning to grasp the implications of what they were hearing. Dr. Chen presented me with a data tablet containing detailed psychological profiles of every officer in my fleet, not just their military records, but personality assessments, behavioral predictions, even analysis of their personal relationships and childhood experiences. He knew more about my own crew than I did. "How could they have gathered such information?" asked Colonel Vexathari, her voice tight with concern. "They had been monitoring our communications for years. Not just military channels, but personal transmissions, entertainment broadcasts, even private correspondence between family members. Their computers had analyzed billions of individual data points to create comprehensive psychological models of our entire species. Kethvar paused to let this information sink in. The horror on the faces around him was exactly what he had felt during that meeting decades ago. But the truly terrifying part was what they had done with that information. Dr. Chen explained that they had used their psychological models to design what he called optimal conflict resolution strategies. They had predetermined exactly how we would react to various scenarios and had prepared appropriate responses to each possible course of action. "You mean they had planned this entire encounter in advance?" asked Sergeant Yixtal. "Not just planned it, they had scripted it. Dr. Chen showed me documents containing transcripts of our conversation, written months before we had ever met. They had predicted not just my general responses, but my exact words, my emotional reactions, even the specific arguments I would use to try to maintain my position." The old commander's voice grew very quiet, barely audible above the ambient sounds of the hall. He had come to Zerion to test their psychological warfare models, not to defeat us in battle, but to demonstrate that they could manipulate our decision-making processes with absolute precision. Every choice we thought we were making freely had been anticipated and accounted for. A long silence settled over the group. The implications of what they were hearing extended far beyond military tactics into fundamental questions about free will and mental autonomy. "What did they want from you?" asked one of the technical specialists. "Nothing we weren't already willing to give," Kethvar replied. "They had analyzed our economic needs, our resource requirements, our expansion plans. They knew that Zephyrian interests in the Zerion system were purely financial. We needed the rare minerals for our technology sector. So they offered to provide those minerals at below-market prices in exchange for formal recognition of human territorial claims." "That sounds reasonable," suggested Lieutenant Morgeth. "It was perfectly reasonable," Kethvar agreed. "That was the point. They had designed an offer that addressed all of our practical concerns while advancing their own strategic objectives. We got what we needed economically while they established a legal precedent for human expansion into disputed territories." "But why was that terrifying?" asked the lieutenant. Kethvar looked at the young officer with something approaching pity. "Because it meant they understood us better than we understood ourselves, Lieutenant. They had identified desires and motivations we weren't even aware of, and had crafted solutions that satisfied needs we hadn't realized we had." He stood once more and walked to the center of the room, addressing the entire crowd. Dr. Chen explained their long-term strategy. They weren't interested in conquering territories or subjugating other species. They wanted to become indispensable partners. By understanding the psychology of different civilizations, they could always offer solutions that seemed beneficial to all parties while gradually increasing human influence and control. "Control through cooperation rather than conquest," mused Colonel Vexithari. "Exactly. And the most frightening part was that it worked. I found myself agreeing to terms that were far more generous to humans than anything I had been authorized to negotiate. Not because I was coerced or threatened, but because their proposals seemed so logical, so mutually beneficial, that opposing them would have been irrational." Kethvar returned to his seat, suddenly looking exhausted. "The entire engagement lasted less than 4 hours. No shots were fired, no ships were damaged, no lives were lost. We signed a trade agreement that appeared to benefit both species equally and departed the system with a cargo hold full of rare minerals. High Command praised the mission as a perfect example of diplomatic resolution." "But you knew better," said Sergeant Yixtal. "I knew that we had been outmaneuvered so completely that we never even realized we were in a battle. The humans had achieved their objectives without us understanding what those objectives were. They had gained territorial recognition, established trade relationships, and gathered detailed intelligence on our fleet capabilities. all while making us believe we had negotiated a favorable agreement. The old commander took another long drink from his cup. But the true lesson came later, when I tried to report what had really happened. High Command didn't want to hear about psychological manipulation or technological capabilities beyond our understanding. They saw a successful negotiation that had avoided costly military action. My warnings about human capabilities were dismissed as paranoid speculation. "Did they continue expanding?" asked one of the senior officers. "Oh yes," Kethvar replied. "Over the next few years, humans established trade partnerships with dozens of species throughout the sector, always offering beneficial terms, always solving problems their partners didn't realize they had, always expanding their influence through cooperation rather than conquest." He looked around the room, seeing his own fears reflected in the faces of his audience. "And every species they partnered with became more dependent on human trade, human technology, human expertise, not through force or coercion, but through carefully engineered economic and social relationships that made independence increasingly difficult to maintain." "Are we dependent on them?" asked Lieutenant Morgeth quietly. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in that familiar sound of deep sorrow. "Check the trade manifests from our outer colonies, Lieutenant. Look at the technology specifications for our newest ships. Examine the materials used in our most advanced weapons systems. Then ask me that question again." The room had grown very cold, despite the heating units. The implications of what they were hearing extended far beyond military concerns, into questions about the fundamental independence of their entire civilization. "But that's not the worst part," Kethvar continued. "The worst part is that I still have one more tale to tell. The third encounter, when I learned what humans do when they decide a species is too dangerous to be allowed to exist." He stood slowly, gathering his cloak around his shoulders. "Tomorrow night, I'll tell you about the Kralek's extinction, and you'll understand why some victories are worse than any defeat." As the crowd dispersed, their conversations were subdued and worried. The peaceful city beyond the windows seemed less secure now, its tranquility dependent on the continued goodwill of a species that understood manipulation better than any civilization in galactic history. Kethvar remained at his table long after the others had left, staring into his empty cup and wondering if the humans already knew about these conversations. Somewhere in their vast information networks, algorithms were analyzing communication patterns, behavioral indicators, and psychological profiles. They would know about his stories before the final tale was told. The thought made him shiver despite the warmth of the hall. Tomorrow, he would have to describe the fate of a species that had challenged human expansion once too often. Tomorrow, his audience would learn what happened when humans stopped offering partnerships and started implementing final solutions. But tonight, he would try to forget the sound of human voices explaining the logic behind genocide with the same calm rationality they had used to negotiate trade agreements. The humans were still out there, still learning, still growing stronger. And now they knew that at least one Zephyrian understood what they were really capable of. Kethvar stood and walked slowly toward the exit, trying not to think about the third tale he would have to tell. The tale of what happened when humans decided that a species had become too great a threat to their expanding influence. The final tale would be the hardest to tell, and the most important for his people to hear. The Veterans Hall had been closed to the general public for 3 days. Official reports claimed routine maintenance, but everyone in the military district knew the truth. High Command had finally taken notice of Kethvar's stories, and they wanted to control who heard the final tale. The crowd that gathered on the appointed night was smaller but more significant. Fleet commanders, intelligence chiefs, and strategic planners who held the future of Zephyrian civilization in their hands. Kethvar sat at his usual table, but everything else had changed. Guards stood at the entrances, signal jammers hummed quietly in the corners, and recording devices captured every word for analysis. The informal atmosphere of previous nights had been replaced by an official debriefing, complete with stenographers and tactical analysts. "Commander Kethvar," spoke Admiral Thexnall, the current head of fleet operations, "we have verified portions of your previous accounts through classified intelligence sources. While some details remain unconfirmed, the general pattern you've described matches observed human expansion throughout this sector. We need to hear your final tale, and we need to understand what it means for our future security." Kethvar looked around the room, noting the grim faces of officers who had finally begun to grasp the true nature of the threat they faced. These were not young recruits hungry for glory, but experienced commanders who understood the implications of technological and psychological superiority. "The third encounter," he began slowly, "took place 32 cycles after Zerion. By then, humans had established themselves as a major power in local space, not through conquest, but through what they called cooperative integration. More than 40 species had signed various forms of partnership agreements, creating an economic and technological network that spanned dozens of star systems." He paused to study the faces around him, seeing the recognition in their eyes. The Zephyrian Republic itself had signed 3 separate trade agreements with human companies during that period. "I was serving as sector commander at the time, responsible for monitoring non-Zephyrian activities in our border regions. My staff had been tracking unusual patterns in human expansion. Their partnerships always seemed to target species with specific technological or strategic capabilities, and their integration processes followed remarkably similar patterns, regardless of local conditions." "What kind of patterns?" asked Admiral Thexnall. "Economic dependence, technological standardization, and cultural adaptation," Kethvar replied. "Human partners gradually adopted human communication protocols, human manufacturing standards, and human educational systems, always presented as beneficial upgrades, always implemented through voluntary cooperation, but always moving toward greater integration with human civilization." Colonel Vexithari leaned forward in her seat. "You're describing assimilation." "I prefer the term voluntary absorption," Kethvar said grimly. "The humans never forced compliance. They simply made their way of doing things so obviously superior that resistance seemed foolish. Within a generation, most partner species had become culturally and technologically indistinguishable from human colonies." He stood and walked to a wall display showing current sector boundaries. Most of the map was colored in various shades of blue, indicating human-influenced territories. But there was one species that refused to integrate. The Kralex Confederation had signed initial trade agreements with humans, but balked when it came to deeper cooperation. They were proud warriors with a military tradition older than most civilizations, and they refused to adopt human technological standards or cultural practices. "Similar to our own position," observed General Morthak. "Very similar," Kethvar agreed. "The Kralex had powerful fleets, advanced weapons technology, and a strong sense of cultural identity. They wanted the benefits of human trade without the obligations of human partnership. For several years, this created tension, but no open conflict." Kethvar returned to his seat, his movements more deliberate than usual. "The crisis began when the Kralex developed what they called a consciousness barrier, a psychological defense system designed to protect their personnel from human manipulation techniques. They had studied the same patterns I had observed and concluded that humans were using sophisticated psychological warfare to control their partners." "Were they correct?" asked Admiral Thexnall. "Absolutely," Kethvar replied without hesitation. "The consciousness barrier was remarkably effective. It used a combination of genetic modification and neural implants to make Kralex individuals immune to the kind of psychological manipulation humans had perfected. For the first time, humans encountered a species they couldn't influence through their standard methods. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. The implications were clear. If the Kralex had succeeded in developing effective defenses, other species could do the same. "How did the humans respond?" asked Colonel Vexithari. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in that familiar sound of deep sorrow, but this time it was accompanied by something new, a note of absolute terror. "They offered to help the Kralex improve their consciousness barriers." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Several officers began speaking at once before Admiral Thexanal restored order. "Explain that statement, Commander." "The humans sent a delegation of neuroscientists and cognitive specialists to the Kralex homeworld. They claimed to be fascinated by the consciousness barrier technology and wanted to collaborate on improving its effectiveness. They offered to share their own research into mental defense systems, supposedly to help the Kralex protect themselves from other species who might try to use psychological warfare." "The Kralex agreed?" asked someone. "Enthusiastically," Kethvar replied. "They saw it as validation of their defensive strategy and an opportunity to gain access to human research data. The collaboration lasted for almost 2 full cycles, with human scientists working alongside Kralex researchers to refine and enhance the consciousness barriers." "But it was a trap," said General Morthak. "It was education," Kethvar corrected. "The humans weren't trying to sabotage the consciousness barriers. They were learning how they worked, how they could be improved, and most importantly, how they could be defeated. Every enhancement the Kralex made gave humans more information about the underlying principles of psychological defense." The old commander stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful city below. After 2 cycles of collaboration, the humans announced that they had made a breakthrough in consciousness barrier technology. They had developed what they called a selective enhancement that would make the barriers even more effective while allowing for limited cooperative integration with trusted allies. "And the Kralex accepted this enhancement?" asked Admiral Thexnal. "They begged for it," Kethvar said quietly. The humans had convinced them that other species were developing psychological weapons specifically designed to penetrate consciousness barriers. The only way to stay protected was to accept the selective enhancement, which would provide absolute immunity while maintaining the ability to cooperate with humans when necessary. The modification was distributed throughout the Kralex Confederation as a mandatory upgrade. Every citizen, every soldier, every leader received the enhanced consciousness barriers. They believed they had achieved perfect protection from mental manipulation. Kethvar turned away from the window, his 6 eyes reflecting a horror that had not diminished over the decades. 3 days after the last Kralex citizen received the enhancement, they all died. The room fell completely silent. Even the mechanical sounds of the recording equipment seemed muted by the weight of what they had heard. "Not killed," Kethvar continued. "Died, peacefully, quietly, without struggle or pain. The enhancement included a neural pathway that could be activated remotely. When the humans sent the activation signal, every enhanced consciousness barrier in the Kralex Confederation simply shut down their owners' nervous systems." "Genocide," whispered Colonel Vexthari. "Extinction," Kethvar corrected. "Complete, absolute, irreversible extinction. 47 billion Kralex individuals died simultaneously, leaving behind intact cities, functional ships, and detailed records of everything they had ever known. The humans moved in immediately to preserve their technology and cultural artifacts." Admiral Thexnal had gone pale beneath his scales. "How do we know this? How do you know this?" "Because I was there," Kethvar replied simply. The humans invited observer delegations from several species to witness what they called the final resolution of the Kralex problem. They wanted us to see exactly what happened to species that refused to integrate into their cooperative framework. "You watched them commit genocide?" asked General Morthak, his voice barely controlled. "I watched them demonstrate that genocide was obsolete," Kethvar said. "They didn't destroy the Kraleks out of anger or hatred. They eliminated them because the Kraleks had become a threat to the stability of human expansion. It was a practical decision, implemented with clinical efficiency." The old commander walked to the center of the room, addressing the entire assembled leadership. The human representative, Dr. Sarah Martinez, explained their reasoning with perfect logic. The Kraleks had developed effective defenses against psychological manipulation, and they were sharing that technology with other species. If consciousness barriers became widespread, humans would lose their primary tool for peaceful integration. Therefore, the Kraleks had to be removed before their defensive technology could destabilize the entire cooperation framework. "But why show it to other species?" asked Admiral Thexnall. "To teach us," Kethvar replied. Dr. Martinez made it very clear that the Kraleks' extinction was not a punishment or a threat. It was an educational demonstration. She wanted us to understand that humans preferred cooperation and integration, but they were prepared to use more direct methods when necessary. He paused, remembering the exact words that still haunted his dreams. She said, and I quote, "We hope this will never be necessary again. The Kraleks chose to position themselves as opponents of peaceful cooperation, and we had to respond appropriately. We prefer to work with our neighbors rather than replace them. But we will not allow our expansion to be hindered by species who refuse to participate in the greater galactic community." The room had grown cold despite the heating systems. Several officers were visibly shaken, while others wore expressions of grim calculation. "Did anyone protest?" asked Colonel Vexithari. "Dr. Martinez invited questions and objections," Kethvar replied. "When Ambassador Feltek from the Morvani Union suggested that the extinction violated accepted standards of interspecies relations, she presented a detailed analysis showing that the Kraleks had been planning to develop weapons specifically designed to kill humans en masse." "Were they?" asked General Morthak. "The evidence was compelling," Kethvar admitted. "Computer records, military communications, research data, everything needed to demonstrate that the Kraleks had been preparing for eventual warfare against human expansion. Of course, we later learned that humans had been monitoring and analyzing Kraleks communications for years. It's possible they had influenced Kraleks' decision-making to create the very threat they used to justify their extinction." Admiral Thexnall leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "You're saying they may have manipulated the Kraleks into becoming a threat so they would have an excuse to eliminate them?" "I'm saying that humans understand long-term strategic planning better than any species we've encountered," Kethvar replied. "Whether they manipulated the Kraleks into hostility or simply predicted it accurately, the result was the same. They had perfect justification for their actions, and no one could argue with their logic." He walked back to his seat, suddenly looking far older than his centuries. The demonstration ended with Dr. Martinez offering enhanced cooperation packages to all observer species, improved trade terms, advanced technology sharing, and guaranteed protection from threats like the one the Kraleks had represented. Several ambassadors signed preliminary agreements before leaving the system. "Did you?" asked Admiral Thexnall quietly. "I recommended against it in my official report," Kethvar said, "but my superiors overruled my objections. They believed that cooperation was preferable to the alternative we had witnessed. Within a year, we had signed the Enhanced Partnership Accord that governs our current relationship with human space." The old commander looked around the room, seeing his own fears reflected in the faces of Zephyrian leadership. "That was 60 cycles ago. Since then, human influence in our sector has grown dramatically. Not through conquest or coercion, but through voluntary cooperation and beneficial partnerships. And every species that has tried to develop defenses against human influence has found themselves facing insurmountable problems that can only be solved through deeper integration. Are you saying we're being manipulated right now? Asked Colonel Vexithari. I'm saying that humans understand us better than we understand ourselves, Kethvar replied. They know what we want, what we fear, what we need, and they provide solutions to problems we don't realize we have until they offer to fix them. He stood once more and walked to the wall display showing sector boundaries. Look at this map. 40 years ago, humans controlled 3 star systems. Today, they have formal partnerships with species controlling more than 200 systems. Not through invasion or conquest, but through cooperation and mutual benefit. Every partnership makes them stronger and makes their partners more dependent on their continued goodwill. What do you recommend? Asked Admiral Thexnal. Kethvar was quiet for a long moment, studying the map and the faces of the officers who would decide his people's future. I recommend that we remember the Kraleks, he said finally. They were proud warriors with advanced technology and strong cultural identity. They believed they could resist human influence through superior defenses and military strength. They died believing they had achieved perfect protection from human manipulation. He turned away from the map and faced the assembled leadership directly. I recommend that we be very careful about developing technologies or strategies that humans might perceive as threats to their expansion. I recommend that we continue our current cooperation while maintaining the fiction that it's voluntary. And I recommend that we never, ever give humans a reason to demonstrate their problem-solving capabilities on us. The room was silent except for the soft humming of recording equipment, capturing every word for future analysis. Is there any hope? Asked someone quietly. Kethvar considered the question carefully before responding. Humans are not evil, Admiral. They're not motivated by cruelty or hatred. They simply have a different perspective on survival and expansion than other species we've encountered. They see the galaxy as a system that needs to be optimized for maximum efficiency and minimum conflict. They believe their methods produce the best outcomes for everyone involved. And they may be right, he continued. Species that cooperate with humans tend to become more prosperous, more technologically advanced, and more peaceful. The price is independence, cultural autonomy, and the ability to choose a different path. But they're still choosing for us, said Colonel Vexthari. Yes, Kethvar agreed. They're choosing for all of us, and the Kraleks taught us what happens to species that try to reclaim that choice. Admiral Thexnal stood slowly, signaling the end of the debriefing. Thank you, Commander. Your insights will be invaluable as we consider our future strategic options. As the crowd dispersed, Kethvar remained at his table, staring at his empty cup and thinking about the peaceful city beyond the windows. Somewhere in human space, algorithms were analyzing the communication patterns from tonight's meeting. Psychological profiles were being updated, strategic responses were being calculated, and optimal integration pathways were being prepared. The humans already knew everything he had told tonight. They had probably predicted his words, his audience's reactions, and the policy decisions that would result from his revelations. His tales of human capabilities were just another data point in their vast understanding of Zephyrian psychology. But perhaps that was the most terrifying lesson of all. Even knowing they were being manipulated, even understanding the techniques being used against them, the Zephyrians had no choice but to continue cooperating. The alternative had been demonstrated with clinical clarity in the empty space where the Kraleks Confederation once thrived. Kethvar stood and walked slowly toward the exit, past the guards and recording equipment that would ensure his words reached the highest levels of government. Tomorrow, policymakers would debate response options. They would consider defensive measures, alternative strategies, and contingency plans. And somewhere in human space, other algorithms would analyze those debates, predict those strategies, and prepare appropriate counter-responses. The great game continued, with only one species truly understanding the rules. The old commander stepped out into the night air and looked up at the stars, wondering which ones had once shone on thriving civilizations that no longer existed. The humans were still out there, still expanding, still optimizing the galaxy for maximum efficiency and minimum resistance. And every species that had tried to resist them had learned the same lesson the Kralliks had learned. Cooperation was not optional. The only choice was between voluntary integration and involuntary replacement. Kethvar pulled his cloak tighter against the cold and walked home through empty streets, carrying with him the weight of knowledge that would shape his people's future. Behind him, the Veterans' Hall fell dark, but the conversations sparked by his tales would continue in classified briefing rooms and secure communication channels. The humans were coming, not as conquerors or destroyers, but as teachers and partners who would show the galaxy a better way to live, whether anyone wanted to learn their lessons or not. The choice was no longer theirs to make.